I sometimes wonder whether maybe the classical philologists don't want us to learn Latin. Who knows? Hello, welcome to this new video on my YouTube channel, and this time the question that I want to talk about, the topic of this video is whether we should learn Latin or not. So should we learn or not, and why? Maybe like, why should we learn Latin? What does Latin gives us? I made a similar video in Polish and it was published just recently. It's been published just recently, so I was asked for a English version, so I'm super happy to do this, and because I think it's a very important topic. And why did I say that maybe some classical philologists don't want us to really know the reason why we learn Latin? Is it's a little bit, of course, like to grab the attention, but it's also a little bit true in the way when we examine the arguments they give us. Why should we learn Latin, for like when they answer this question? So the Polish video started actually, well, the inspiration to this video was an interview with one of Polish bestseller authors, Marek Krajewski, who writes books, crime stories, which are very popular. But he also has a PhD in Latin, in classics. He taught Latin in the University of Wrocław for many years. So he is like supporting the idea in this interview that we should teach Latin, teach our children Latin, even in the 21st century, which I totally agree with. I think that yes, we should do this. But the arguments he gives are arguments that are repeated all over the world, with some variations, nuances, local variations, and many of them are not, in my opinion, are not the things that we should learn Latin for. Like, so let's get to the details. First, I would like to discuss the things why not. So what are not the reasons to learn Latin? First thing that is very usually quoted by philologists or any other Latin enthusiasts is that Latin helps us learn foreign languages. Or in the English-speaking world, we can always very often get the argument that Latin helps us know more English vocabulary and understand it better. Why I don't think it's true? Because it's not Latin that does it. First of all, if we learn a foreign language, it always will help us facilitate our skills, our ability to learn more foreign languages. So if we are monolingual and we know only one language, let's say it's English, and then we learn Spanish, it will help us learn Polish, surprisingly, because it's still this Indo-European family. It will help us learn any other language, because first foreign language is like opening our mind to the idea of a foreign language. So I think personally it's usually the most difficult. So yes, if Latin is your first foreign language, for sure it helps. It helps because it's the root of other Romance languages. But many people would argue, why learn Latin? If you want to learn many foreign languages, don't learn Latin, just learn the foreign languages themselves. Don't waste time on them. The method that is used in teaching Latin very often, so the grammar translation method, so there is a lot is used as an argument here, because many people would say that Latin gives you this grammatical understanding of what language is, which is totally not true. And this is like, I see it from my own example. I'm Polish. I'm not a native English speaker, and my first foreign language that I've learned was English. I've been learning it for ages, and I'm still learning to make it better. But during this process of learning English, I learned a lot of English grammar. I learned it in a very nice way. So first I started using the words, the phrases, the sentences. I didn't maybe know exactly what tense is used in a question. Have you done your homework? But later, well, this tense was explained to me that this is present perfect and we use it in this and that way. So with English, learning English helped me a lot with grammar. And actually, English and some Polish. I mean, we learned some Polish grammar at school, or at least I learned. I didn't like it very much, though. It was like a really strange thing for me. Maybe I wasn't that interested at the time, which I regret, because that would be great help now. But you know, having in my language having cases and things like this helps a lot when it comes to learning similar things in other languages. So Polish and English made this fundament for learning other languages for me. So when I learned Latin grammar, the fact that I knew English very well already helped me to understand it. What's more, before I started learning Latin, I learned German. And knowing German grammar helped me learn Latin. I'm just saying that learning Latin per se is not the reason why you're good at languages. You can do the same. You can have the same result with other languages. So I don't think it matters here. With expanding your vocabulary in English when you're an English speaker, I don't think so. You just can. Well, I expanded my Latin-derived English vocabulary by learning English. I don't think that we necessarily need to learn Latin for this. Of course, it's like nice and it's interesting maybe for some people to know the roots of the words. Yeah, I can agree with one thing here, though, that it can help you with spelling if you know Latin, because many words the spelling would start to make sense. English spelling is very interesting, in my opinion, result of a lot of historical processes, and I love it. But it's it can be challenging. I understand that, and yes, Latin can be at least a little bit helpful. But who would learn the whole language just to you know, make it easier for the person to spell the words? I think this is not the good reason. And actually, if you learned Italian or French for English, it would be French, this could have a similar effect, because many words were derived from Latin, but through the means of French language. So maybe that would be a better choice, like a more wise, like in our times we would say wiser, because French is available and you can use French for business or whatever. The other thing is that what I very often see, that Latin develops some kind of magically, in my opinion, that would be logical thinking skills, logical thinking skills, or things like this, that you can be more analytic in your thinking because of the magical nature of this language. And I disagree. I mean, yes, translation per se itself. And there's another thing. I can use per se, or I can use ad hoc, like words from Latin, but I don't need to learn Latin to understand them. It's like synonyms of many words, and I use them because I tend to like Latin and use these words, but actually they can be replaced as the phrases or sentences or proverbs or something. You don't need to use the original Latin proverb, I don't know, per aspera ad astra. Just, you can say it in English. I don't know actually the English translation for it. I know the Polish one, but through the difficulties to stars, yes, as they say, you get to stars through all the obstacles, so something, so through difficult things. And it has the same meaning, and you don't need to be this showing off person who shows off that is better by means of using here and there Latin phrase and actually not understanding it very well. because you know how to translate it, but you don't feel the language. You can't play with it and sometimes replace the words or something, make it let's say alive. But coming back to this logical thinking, I would say that this doesn't work because of Latin. First, you can learn a lot of these things simply by learning how to program computers. Programming languages are a great way of learning how algorithms work, how 0-1 Boolean logic works, and they can be used for that purpose. We can learn this like deep language skills. I mean, it's not language skills. These translation skills, because these are translation skills of choosing the best translation in our process of translating English to Spanish. I think personally that would have the same effect. And translation doesn't mean that you know the language. And translation is well, it's sometimes thought that we can do, I don't know why still in the 21st century, but I still have this feeling that some people think that we can have this one-to-one translation. But no, we cannot. If you look, like, I don't know, maybe in English-speaking world, it's a little bit different view, because a lot of literature has been written in English. And for example, Shakespeare is a worldwide famous person, a writer. But there are many translations of Shakespeare works into each of the languages, at least in some. In Polish we have a few at least, which are different. Some of them are more faithful to the words that are used, like to the literal meaning. Some of them are not so faithful as far as words are concerned, but they are much nicer to read. They are much more interesting. One would say probably much they are beautiful, more beautiful than some other translations. And as Italians say, traduttore, traditore, I might mispronounce it, but the meaning is that the translator is also a traitor. So it's actually a liar. Translator is a liar, because liar, well, not consciously, or maybe, but anyway, it's never faithful enough. One can do it differently, better, or not better, but differently, which makes it useful. So I don't think that these two things, well, general language skills, some kind of logical skills, are the things to learn Latin. Are the results of learning Latin. You can get them, and many would reasonably argue, by other means, which in modern world seem to be much more like, these things are much more useful for business, for your future career. And Latin, if only based on these, would be a waste of time. And this is what I see. I studied Latin, I studied many languages, I graduated in English translations, and I know that translation, English, Polish, Polish, English, is a very difficult thing. And really, you don't need Latin to have all these questions and problems, how to translate a text that is, I don't know, text of a scientific book, text of a book that makes science more popular, popularizes science, literature, poetry. Each of these genres has its own obstacles, difficulties. If you make a sworn translation, maybe the style is not so important. It's very important to have this like faithful, I don't know, technically or legally faithful translation. So no, these are not, in my opinion, not the reasons to learn Latin. And you know, like when I learn Latin, it's not that I want to translate these works. If I wanted to translate them, why bother? These translations have been made for centuries. And of course they are not perfect, but if I wanted a translation, I wouldn't be able to produce a better translation. And of course, if I need to translate from Latin into any, like, I don't know, English, for example, I need to have a very good English skills. You know, like you have to, your English style has to be very good. I experienced it in translating from English to Polish, that actually if you're not good in your mother tongue, and it happens very often, you're not going to be a good translator. And people who would read your translation wouldn't understand the text. So they would understand maybe the Polish text, but that text would be so much different from the original that we would call it like it's bad translation. So there is no reason for those translation choices. So I would say no, translation is not the reason. I can read Cicero translated into English, I can read it translated into Polish, and I don't need to well, I can read a translation. I don't need to learn Latin to make another translation. But as I said, and now we are coming to why learn Latin. What's the real reason to learn Latin is to get to those texts. As I said, translation is a lie that many of us need because we don't know all the languages. But if there is any special interest in us for the culture, the history of antiquity, of Roman antiquity, Latin is the key. If we're interested generally in culture, in European culture especially, Latin is the key. Because you have to take a Latin text and read it. Not translate it, because you won't understand. Sometimes your translation could be so poor that you would be misled by your own translation. No, you have to get to this level when you read the text. Why do people learn foreign languages? They learn them to get to contact those who produce things in those languages, orally or in a written form. So people learn English to read Shakespeare, to read Tolkien, to read tons of English literature. Actually, I would say English is this privilege language, privileged because of very hard work during centuries of many English-speaking people to produce such wonderful works of their culture. Of course, there is also the whole economical, historical thing, but one cannot say that English literature is not beautiful, not rich, and it's really worth learning English to get to the literature. It's really worth learning Polish to get to Polish literature, which I find very interesting. Maybe not as many writers as English in the English-speaking world, just by the facts of numbers. But nowadays, many people learn Polish because they want to read The Witcher. The Witcher is the book that the game The Witcher is based on. So many people who played the game now want to read the book. And some of them who want to read the book don't want to read the translation, they want to read the original text. So this is why we want to get to those texts, to texts written in Latin, because we want to communicate with those people. We want to have their original thought as close as can be. But it's not only antiquity. I think most of us know and would agree that the whole period of Middle Ages, which is more or less 1000 years, if you want to know the literature, history, culture, whatever from this period, you need to learn Latin. So there are thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of books, works, literally works, written all over Europe in Latin that are waiting for us to discover them. But that's not the end. Then we have all this post-medieval period when works in Latin, Latin works were continued to be created. For sure, all of us have heard about Newton. His works were published in Latin. I hope that everyone heard of the great Polish astronomer Nicolaus Copernicus, who wrote his works in Latin. Actually, it's quite interesting because Polish culture was very, very much like in love with Latin. And not only in the Middle Ages, but also in the next centuries. Many, sometimes even more works were published in Latin than in Polish. And just to give you some examples, late Middle Ages or early Renaissance, Paweł Włodkowic, his works, he's a very famous thinker about social, political topics, and very influential all over the Europe, and quite important author at that time in Europe. He wrote in Latin, so if you want to get to his works, you need Latin. Well, we have another world famous guy, Maciej Kazimierz Sarbiewski, with his lyric, a Latin poet who is called the second Horatio, the Christian Horatio. So I don't know Latin yet so good to judge, but he was translated in the, I think, in the 17th century, because he lived in the 17th century. So yes, in 17th century he was translated into English and many other languages already, but he was the guy who was read in Latin all over Europe. His works consist not only of poetry. He wrote the Gentium, as you see, quite a big thing. So it's a bilingual edition of in Latin Polish, which was used all over the Europe to teach people about Roman religion. So people learned from this work, which was written in Latin, about Roman culture, about the religion. So they didn't take English books, French books, Italian books. They took Latin books to read about those things. And I'm personally convinced that if you learn about the culture, the history in the language of this culture, you learn a lot more things. So we have a world famous poet and author from Poland. There is, I don't know whether the guy is so famous all over the world, but very important for Polish culture, history of thought, of political thought, is Andrea Frickius Moderaeus, and it's one of his works, and he wrote in Latin, and he lived, let me tell you, where I find this, in the 16th century. So we have 16th century, we have 17th century authors. Another different example, but an example of also like 16th, 17th century writer is this is a letter to Szymon Szymonowic, written by Stanisław Reszka, and it's written in Latin. So people in Poland wrote in the 16th century. This letter is from the 16th century, the very end of the 16th century, and the 17th century wrote letters to each other in Latin. I have a book about history of Polish literature, and it's in Polish, so of course just give you a little hint here. But when we open the index, here we have a part about Middle Ages, and we have literature in Latin, literature in Poland. 15th century, so in Poland it's late Middle Ages, Latin literature, Polish literature. Humanism, Reformation, 16th century, the beginning of 17th, Latin literature, and on the next page you have Polish literature. Then if we go here, yes, we have then 18 here, well, because it's like, okay, here 17th century, here it's here again, Latin and Polish literature. So just in Poland, then like the literature is, there is no separation between Latin and Polish literature, and because in the 18th century the grammar translation approach started the idea that we should like stronger for learning, like strong appreciation of national languages was introduced. So Latin, I would say this is the moment when in Polish history, and then because of the fall of Polish Empire, of the divisions between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. So the end of the Polish country for 123 years. This like stopped this this thriving Latin culture, and I would give you the example, the quote, if I find it right now, about the situation in Poland, because it was quite phenomenal in the whole Europe. But I won't find it, of course, as I closed it. But there were people from I found it. People from all over the Europe who came to Poland and wrote diaries. And in those diaries, for example, Ulrich Verdun, I don't know how to, it's a Polonized name here, I would have to check. I don't know how to pronounce it, like what's his name in English, but he was in Poland. He came to Poland in 1617, and he mentions in his diary that in a city of Lębach, Lwów, one of the women living there, just from these city class people living in the city, when she recognized that he's a foreigner, she started speaking to him in Latin, in classical Latin, because, like, you know, our choice is English nowadays because it's like the default foreign language, and for people in Poland, the choice to communicate with non-Polish people was to choose Latin. It turns out Ferdinand II, the Kaiser, he talked Latin with. So he went to Gniezno, to the archbishop, probably, but he talked with his, you know, this guy that when you have horse carters, and the guy that sits and says, "Oh, go horse, go horse." I didn't know the English word for it. Sorry. He was talking with this guy in Latin, and like I read another French diary when Polish delegation came to Paris, and everyone spoke perfect Latin according to the diary, which surprised people there. And like, it's just Polish culture, yes? I'm not saying that everyone should, well, learn Polish culture, learn Polish literature, which is abundant, and I know scholars from all over the world, please come, take those texts. Most of them have not been translated. You can go to polona.pl. It's a service where there are lots of texts scanned, like old editions and work content. But I just gave you an example. Why learn Latin? Because we want to get to this culture, because those wonderful texts are waiting for us. We learn English to read Tolkien. We learn German to read Goethe. We learn Latin to read Cicero, or Cicero, Andrzej Frycz-Majewski, Maciej Stawiewski, Newton, Nicolaus Copernicus, Bede, and many, many others. And that's why we don't need translations, in my opinion. That's why we need living Latin, because we want to take those texts and read. Many people who want to learn this don't want to be scholars, don't want to read Cicero to analyze each word in the way like, oh, maybe when he said this, he thought that, and, you know, like you try to connect all the dots. I think that just as we read in our own mother tongues, philosophers, books, novels, history books, and things like this, we learn them very often for pleasure. We sit in our chairs, armchairs, or lie on our sofas in bed and just read them and have fun, entertainment. And we can do it in other foreign to us languages, like I did with Tolkien, with Anne Rice, The Diaries of the Vampire, and like I'm reading a crime book from the series about Wilsberg, who is a owner of an antiquariat so it's a German book. I read it for pleasure. I don't maybe understand each word, but I don't care. Like, it's still good enough. So that's why we learn Latin, to contact. That's why people who are not going to be scholars, classical philologists, can learn Latin, like me. Of course, I would like to know Latin perfectly. I'm this language freak. But first and foremost for me, before I write my own Opus Magnus, I want to read it. I just want to take those books written in my culture. I want to take books from different cultures, Roman culture, English culture, Bede, for example, and others, and read them. And I think this is really why we want to learn Latin. Other things we can, and this is reasonable to say, we can do in a different way, but we can't get to those texts, really get, if we don't know Latin. And this is what really Excitat Studio makes it interesting, makes it like, wow, I want to do it. Because there is something really like new. Like each person that learns languages says that contact with other cultures expands your horizons, makes you think in different ways. That's why people are interested in the cultures, the works of cultures which were written in Latin. And from a more practical point of view, sometimes you can even go to a schola, to a Latin camp, summer school, or whatever. And well, Latin is a useful means of communicating just with living people. But that's another topic. And I hope to do a video about how to learn Latin, what are the means of learning Latin, the best, in my opinion, means of learning Latin. But somewhere in the future, a video like this. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for watching. If you like the video, you can leave a thumbs up. If you don't like it, well, leave the thumbs down. What can I say? Write a comment if you agree, disagree with the topic. I want to give special thanks to all of my Patreon supporters who are scarce so far, but there are some of them. And I can proudly say that I'm super happy to find great people among my Patreon supporters, and I would like to give special thanks to them. So, where are they? Where are you? I forgot to open it earlier, and now I can't see you guys. Benefit. Where are you, manager? In my paid post. What the heck is that? If I can, Patreons. Okay. Yes, I've got you here. I would like to give special thanks to all my Patreon supporters who are in the as they appear on Patreon. Johan Wing, Dan Ogulnik, Alexander Ewing, Dow Williams, Luke Amadeus Ranieri, Martyna Postrzednik, Krzysztof, Aleksandra Utrecht, Magdalena Vaz. And I'm super happy that you are there, and great thanks to you. If you like my channel, if you like my work, well, there is a link to this Patreon site in the description below. So, well, I would be super happy. Okay, thank you once again very much, and see you later. Bye bye. If you like my videos, please subscribe to my channel. This will really help me a lot. Find me also on other social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Mind, and many others. Let's keep in touch. See you next time!